hope that you will enjoy the presentations that we have today. Thank you and all the best to all the presenters.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Kenza. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, participants, wherever you are. I hope you are doing well. Welcome to the second day of today's session for the online school on migration statistics. On this day, yesterday, those who are with us, we started with the population and housing censuses where we had 2 sessions. And today we are going to have 3 sessions, but 2 modules. That is on estimation methods. We'll have 2 presenters for these sessions. First, we'll have wealth information on estimation methods by Hans Peterson, who is the senior statistician, Statistics Sweden. And then later we'll have the second session that is on module 4 for Leave No Migrant Behind, where we look at various methods or various methods of data disaggregation and the sustainable development goals. And we'll have a chance to have 2 guest speakers or presenters for this session. So that is Elisa and Nadia. So, but first, in between the 2 modules, we'll also have a break. But first, we'll start with the first session of estimation methods by Hans Peterson. So Hans, I don't know whether you are online. Are you with us, Hans? If you can hear me,
yes, I can hear you, and I want to share my screen.
Okay. Thank you, Hans. This is your time for the first session. Welcome.
So, I hope you can see my screen now.
Yes, yes, I can see. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm Hans Peterson, and I have been working with the report for the labor migration statistics in Africa, the 3rd edition. So this presentation will be based on my experiences from the work with the 3rd edition. I call my presentation, the title is Estimation Methods for Migration Statistics. So it's sort of a special part of migration statistics, the things we do for the labor migration statistics report. I have a subtitle, A Story About Missing Data. And yeah, almost all the things I will say today has to do with estimation methods and missing data. So those are the 2 keywords for my presentation. Let's see. Yeah, so first of all, what is estimation? Yeah, I think a lot of you listening to this have been in one way or another involved in sample surveys. So you know that estimation, to prepare estimates, that's the step, the final step before you start to tabulate and analyze your data. You have collected your survey data and you have processed your survey data, but to get the final results, you need to carry out an estimation procedure. So that is what we usually call estimation in sample surveys, and that is the area where we more or less exclusively use the word estimation in the statistical sense. So what is done is that we have some what we can call statistical measures, summary measures for a small group of units, households, individuals, farms, or whatever. And those measures can be averages, proportions, totals. And with the estimation procedure, we prepare what we can call a good conjecture, a good estimate of what these measures are in the larger group in the population. So from the sample, we do some calculations on the data in the sample, and then we come up with results or estimates for the population. So we go from a group characteristic to estimate for a population characteristic. And the characteristic may be, as in this case, the average household income in the sample and the average household income in the country. So with the estimation, we can confidently say something about the characteristic for a large group of units, all households in the country, for example. Although we are missing data for most of the units, we don't have data for all the households in the population, just for a small group. But still, we can confidently say something about the whole group, the population. So, well, intuitively, you can understand that the larger group from which we have data, the better should our estimate be. The extreme is, of course, if the group from which we have data are all the units in the population, then we have a very good estimates. Actually, we have more or less the true value for the population. We can put it in another way and say the fewer data or units missing from the survey, the better is the estimate. So there is a relation between the quality of the estimate and the number of missing units from the survey. If we look at sample surveys, the data or the units can be missing for two reasons. One is what I call missing by design. And in a sample survey, we have a sample design where we randomly select units to the sample. So that the sample design is that we should randomly select units to the sample. And that means that we have a number of units that are not in the sample, and those units not in the sample, they are also a sort of random sample from the population. So we have, in a way, we have two random samples. One random sample is the units that come into the sample, and another random sample is the units that did not come into the sample. And both of these are random samples. And because we have selected them with a random procedure, there is no reason to believe that there should be any difference between these two groups, because each unit in the population could have happened to be in one of those two groups. So our presumption is that the units we have in a sample should be more or less like the units we don't have in the sample. And that is a basis for our estimate. We assume that all those missing not in the sample, they look like the units we have in the sample. But then we have missing units due to other causes. Well, what I call the execution of the survey. We may have an imperfect sampling frame. We may have data collection problems in the field. We don't reach all the sample households or individuals or whatever. And we may have households, individuals refusing to participate in the survey. And those missing due to execution of the survey, we cannot assume that they look like the units we selected with the sample. So that is a more complicated, those missing values are more complicated in terms of analysis, of course. So estimation, how is it done? Well, we have our group of units, small group of units, it's just a small part of the population. And what we do is to compensate for a unit missing by design, those missing at random. What we do is to apply sampling weights to the data. And the weights, sampling weights, are the inverted values of the inclusion probabilities. And all units in the population should have a non-zero probability of being included in the sample. So all units should have a chance of being included. And we should be able to calculate that probability. Just to take a simple example, let's say we select a 1% sample of the population. That means that each unit has 1/100 probability of being included. And that means that the sampling weight in this case would be 100. So each unit in the sample will be given the weights, the sampling weight 100. And we use this weight to raise the sample units up to the population level. So each sample unit will represent 99 other units. That is the meaning of the sampling weight 100 in this case. But then we have to compensate also for other missing units for other reasons, non-coverage, non-response, not surveyed, and so on. And for those missing units or data, we have to use other methods like imputation and modeling or calibration. There are many names on these methods to compensate for missing units. So usually we think of estimation of the process under one here, but it always involved the process also under the second. Okay. The presentation I will give here will not be estimation in a traditional sample survey. We will leave the well-ordered situation or world in a well-defined sample survey. And now we come into a much more complicated and messy situation as we have it for our labor migration statistics survey. The survey now is not a well-defined group of units, but it is more, well, you can describe it as the labor migration statistics system for the LMSA, Labor Migration Statistics for Africa. And that is a data collection involving a number of different statistical sources, surveys, censuses, administrative data, and so on. And the survey population is all countries in all the years 2010 to 2019. So our sampling units are country by year. And the characteristics, the variables we are measuring for all units are number of migrants, for example, totals, the labor force participation rate, those are proportions, and we have many other variables we are measuring or trying to measure. So it is not a sample, it is a census, but a census with a lot of missing data. The estimation we do is to compensate for the missing data, not using the sampling estimation procedure, but other procedures as imputation and models. So the presentation will be like this. I start with a sort of very brief overview of sample surveys. And then I go into estimation methods for the LMSA3, that is Labor Migration Statistics for Africa, 3rd edition. And then I look into the experiences from that work. And lastly, I briefly look into the future, the 4th edition, the coming 4th edition, and beyond that edition as well. So let's just look at survey design. Well, all of you have probably been involved in this procedure, well, at least most of you. When you plan, you design, and you execute a sample survey. Those are the main steps you go through when you design your survey. We have been talking about the sample design, selecting a random sample. And when we do that, we know that we will get sampling errors. I will come to that a bit later, but it is basically that if we only survey a small part of the population, our results will not be exactly the population parameters, the population results, but something else. But those are one type of errors we have in a sample surveys. We have a number of errors that comes from other operations in the survey. And mainly from these operations we can see in the red square here. Those are the preparations for the survey, but in each of these stages we can make errors or design the survey in a way that it will not be perfect for getting good results from the survey. So what kind of errors? Well, sampling errors. Due to sampling, all units are not surveyed. Errors due to missing data, you can say. We have frame errors. If we want to select a sample randomly, we need a list of all the units in a population to select the random sample from. If units are missing from the frame, we will have what we call frame errors. If not all households are responding or units are responding to the survey, we will also have missing data due to no observation, no measurements. And we have measurement errors. We get observations from the units. Well, I call it measurement errors. You can also call it response errors. In many surveys, you put questions to households or individuals. If there are errors in the responses, that's response errors, but that is the same thing as what I call measurement errors. And we have processing errors, errors due to mistakes in the data processing. Well, one example would be in a country where you have a household budget survey and you record the purchases, and this country may have a local currency. That means that a bag of 2 kilo rice may cost 10,000 real or whatever. When the interviewer are entering this number 10,000, he may miss a zero. He may put 1 zero too much or 1 zero too less in his data entry. Well, if you have good validation checks, that would not go through the process. But in some countries, you may still have this problem. For example, if you conduct your interview on paper and then enter the data in the central office, for example. Survey errors. This is what I said, sampling error and non-sampling error. The sampling error, that is because we just take a small part. Non-sampling errors are due to mistakes or system deficiencies. We have not trained the interviewers properly, so they do not ask the questions in the questionnaire in the proper way. That is a non-sampling error, a measurement or response error. We could divide the survey errors in another way: observation error and error of non-observation. So the observation errors is basically what we said, measurement error or response errors. We get a response, we get a measurement, but it is wrong for some reason. Errors of non-observations, well, those are the errors because of missing data. Missing because not all units came into the sample, or missing because some individuals or households did not respond to the questions. So this is what I have, what we have briefly touched upon, the frame errors or coverage errors. If there are households, for example, in a household survey, not in the sampling frame, those households will not have a chance of being included. And that would not be a problem if those households are more or less like the households that are on the list on the sampling frame. But if we have reasons to believe that those households differ from the covered households, the households on the list, then we have a problem for our estimation procedure. Non-response errors, yes. Households not responding to the survey. In household surveys, household budget surveys, I should say, there you very often find that very rich households, they refuse to participate in the household budget survey. If that is the case, you do have a problem, because those households are definitely different from the households you get into your survey data. So you have to do something there. Well, sampling errors, you know what it is. Measurement errors, did we measure correctly? Did the interviewers put the question correctly? The thing we measure, is that the measure we are, or is that the phenomenon we are really interested in? That's a question of validity. One thing about the errors, some of them are systematic. Those are errors that tend to go in the same direction. We can call them non-compensating errors. It may be bias, or they will inflict bias in our results. Well, let's say we ask questions about consumption of alcohol in a survey. It's a well-known fact that people tend to underestimate and underreport their alcohol consumption when asked about that in surveys. That would be a systematic error. You will have errors in the same direction for many households. If we ask a question about how tall are you, then people tend to answer as correctly as possible to that question. But they may put 1 centimeter too much or 1 centimeter too less. So in that case, we would have a variable measurement error, an error that go in both directions. And the nice thing with variable errors are that when we add them up over a larger group of people, then those errors tend to cancel out. So when we calculate, for example, the average height of a group of people, this average will be close to the true value. So that is a big difference between bias and variance. Bias is much more difficult to handle than the variance. Sampling error, many of you will know this from your training in statistics. The variance of the mean. We calculate, for example, the average household income. And then if we do that, we can also calculate the variance around the mean, or sorry, the variance of the mean for this average income. So this is the formula. Standard error is just the square root on the variance of the mean. And standard error is a very central and very important concept and important measure in all sample surveys. You will, if you read a report from a sample survey where they don't present standard error for the estimates, then you should consider that report as a very poor report from a sample survey. You need the standard errors to get a feeling for how good are the estimates presented in the sample survey report. So this, you can also write the standard error in this way. Sorry. The Sx is a standard deviation of x. This is a constant. This is a variation among the households in the population in terms of household income, for example. And this is a sample size. If this is a constant, this is the only thing we can play with when we design our sample. And this is a sample size. So you can easily see that if this is large, then this becomes small. So if we have a large sample, this will be small. The standard error will be small. And that is a good thing. If n is small, the sample size is small, then the standard error will be large. So what we do is to plan the sample size so that the standard error will be sufficiently low. Just briefly about confidence interval. You use the standard error multiplied by 2 or 1.96 if we should be strict. That will be the margin, what we call the margin of error for an estimate. So the estimate plus minus the margin of error, that is our confidence interval. If we could repeat the sample survey 1,000 times, then our confidence interval would cover the true population value 950 times out of 1,000. This is 2 confidence intervals from a survey I've been involved in. For Phnom Penh, the capital city, and from other urban household income, household expenditure per capita. And you can see the confidence intervals are not overlapping, meaning that they do not, you cannot say that they're, they do not overlap. That means that there is a significant difference between these two domains, 2 areas when it comes to household expenditure, average households. This is a sampling weight. What we do when we estimate is to use the observation values, the household income for household HIJ. We multiply that with the sampling weights, and then we add up over all the strata. This is adding up over enumeration areas, over strata, regions. Over this is over households, this is over enumeration areas, and this is over provinces, for example. Okay. If we are missing values at random, then we just, if we miss values due to non-response and non-coverage, for example, if we can say that these are missing at random, there is no difference between a responding and non-responding households, then we can just adjust the sampling weights with a factor like this. N is the number of responding households, and N are the sample households. So this will be a factor a bit above 1, so we are compensating for the missing units or data. If the non-response and non-coverage is not missing at random, for example, rich households, then we have to do something else. Post-stratification calibration. Missing due to non-response, due to item non-response. The household or individual is responding, but you don't get all the data from the person or the household. That is item non-response. What we do is in imputation procedures like the nearest neighbor procedure or mean value procedure. So imputation can be seen as a form of estimation. the mean imputation, if we use the mean for the sample group to impute for missing values, that is more or less the same as doing sampling weight adjustments. So that is a common way of imputing values in sample surveys. The nearest neighbor, that is probably the most simple way of imputing values in a data set, and that is to use the same values as the nearest neighbor in your data set. Okay, now we come to part 2. And this is what I said a few minutes ago. This is not a sample survey, it's a census. The survey population is all countries in all the years 2010 to 19. So that our units are country by year. Actually 54 or 55 countries by 10 years. And a lot of data on migrants and labor. Not a sample, it's a census with a lot of missing data. And the estimation we do here is to compensate for the missing data using imputations and models. So we are leaving the sample survey context. Estimation in the presence of missing data, where the data may be collected from other sources, census, admin data, international databases, accounting systems. So specifically, what we're interested in is where we want to present annual statistics. We want to present statistics for every year, 2010 to 2019, for every country, and for a number of variables or a number of characteristics. And we have the data from different sources. So it's a complex and much more messy situation than in an ordinary sample survey. The data set have a lot of holes. You can think about the data set as a cube. In one side we have the 55 countries, and in another side or axis we have the 10 years, and on the third axis we have the different variables. So it's a cube with a lot of cells, 3-dimensional cube with a lot of cells, and a lot of these cells are empty. That's a problem. Yeah. So we impute by using the mean, for example. If we have for a certain country, for a certain variable, we have values except for 1 year, let's say 2014. What we can do is to find the average between the value for 2013 and the value for 2015 and put that average value, we impute that value into this empty cell. That is one way. Another way is we may have several missing values. We are missing the values for 2014 and 15 and 16. What can we do? Well, we cannot use the average for 2013 and 2017 well, we could calculate the average and put into the 3 values missing cells, but the better way would be to calculate a trend from 2013 to 2017, and then put the trend values into 2014, 15, and 16. Another situation is where we may miss a number of values 2010 to 2019, but we can use a model. Let's say we miss the labor force participation rate for migrants. Well, let's say we miss all the values. We have no values for the labor force participation rate for migrants. But we have those rates for the general population. Then we can maybe find a model or use a model from another country saying that the labor force participation rate for migrants is equal to a constant, say 1.1, times the labor force participation rate for population. In this way, we have a model, and we have to rely on that model to impute those modeled values for migrants. Okay, let's continue with examples. Let's say we have data on number of people 15 plus for all the years, and we have data on number of people in the labor force for 2010 and 2012. So we are missing a lot of data, but we have for 10 and 12, 2010 and 12, from, say, a labor force survey. Well, the model in this case would be the proportion of 15 plus people that are in the labor force is constant. So there is a constant proportion labor force among the 15 plus. So basically this is a labor force participation rate. Therefore, we can calculate the mean proportion from 2010 and 2012. And this mean proportion we impute in all the missing data points, that is 2011 and 2013 up to 19. That is one example. Another, it's a bit of a similar example from a previous. We have all the 15 plus people for all the 10 years. And we have the number of people in the labor force for the first year, 2010, and the last year, 2019. Should we do the same as in the last example, calculate the mean for 2010 and 2019 and put in as imputed values for 2011 to 2018? Well, in this case, it would probably be better to see if we can find a trend, because we have a value 2010 and another value 2019. That's 9 years in between these. And if there is a trend in the rate, participation rate, we may see that in our 2 measures from the labor force survey. So what we do is to calculate the trend from 2010 to 2019, and we impute the trend values in the missing data points from 2011 to 2018. We could have done that in our previous example, but it's not a good idea to calculate a trend that is between 2 years that are so close to each other. as 2010 and 2012 as we had in the previous example. So in the previous example, we used the mean, but in this example, we use the trend. But as I said, in the last point, we have to be very careful in this case because we will have uncertainty in the trend due to sampling errors. We have these values from a sample survey and we have sampling errors and they may cause problems when we estimate the trend. We will see that a bit later here. This example is much more tricky because in this case we have no data at all on the people in the labor force. Well, what can we do? Well, we can borrow data from other similar countries. The proportion of 15 plus that are in the labor force, we can assume, or our model will state that the proportion of 15 plus that are in the labor force is equal to the mean value for a group of neighboring countries that resemble our country in important aspects. So then we can use this mean, or we can calculate the mean of the proportion for the other countries and impute trend values of the proportion in all missing data points 2010 to 2019. This is also somewhat dangerous. Can we really rely on similarity? Is our country equal in terms of migrants and labor market and so on as these other countries we borrow data from? Yeah, that is a tricky thing and a reasonable question. But these things are done, and then of course you have to test and try your models and see that there are reasonable models. Yeah, so now we look at this is a country that has done 2 labor force, 2012 and 2017. And we want to present data on number of people for the period, the full period, what to do. Well, we can calculate the trend from 2012 to 2017. And then we can extrapolate the trend to backwards to 2010 and 2011, and also extrapolate the trend to 2018 to 19. But here also we have the problem with the sampling error. We have to be careful with the sampling error when we are calculating trends from sample surveys. And this is what I will show briefly here. Let's say we have a labor force survey with a sample size of 15,000 individuals. The migrant population in the country is 1% of the population. If this is just a plain ordinary labor force survey where no consideration has been taken to oversample migrants, then we can expect to get only 150 migrants in a sample. And that is a very small sample, of course. So what happens if we estimate the labor force participation rate from this very small sample of 150 migrants? Well, let's assume that we estimate the LFPR to 60%. Then we can calculate the standard error. It will be 4.4 percentage units. You may be familiar with this formula. This is P times 1 minus P, or if it is percent, 100 minus P over the sample size, square root. That is the usual formula for the standard error for a proportion. This is a design effect. We don't have time to go into this, but this is due to the fact that we never sample the households directly in a sample survey. We select enumeration areas in the first stage and households in the second stage. So we will always have a factor raising the standard error somewhat compared to the simple random sampling case. Anyway, this is the standard error, and this is a confidence interval. So the confidence interval will be from 51.4% to 68.6% LFPR. The next labor force survey is done 5 years later, say, and we get a somewhat higher rate, 65%. We do the same calculation, we get 4.3. We get this sample size, 56.6, 73.44. This is a trend line. We have 60 and we have 65. These are the confidence intervals. And you can see that the confidence intervals are not, they are overlapping. That means we cannot claim that there is a statistically significant increase in the participation rate over the period. So what is the confidence interval for the trend expressed as the annual increment? Well, the trend is 1 percentage point per year. 65 minus 60 over 5, that is 1 percentage point per year. The standard error for the trend, the annual increment in percentage points, is 2.8. So the confidence interval will be like this, 1 plus minus the margin of error. The confidence interval will be minus 4.5 to 6.5. That is the confidence interval for the annual increase. So, as you can see, this is a meaningless operation to try to say something about the trend in the participation rate for migrants based on a standard labor force survey. So just to show you what happens with a labor force survey when we look at the general population, not the migrants, but for all the individuals in the sample. Then we do the same things as before, but instead of 150, we have 15,000 here. And of course, we get quite a different confidence interval from 59.1 to 60.9. So this is a very narrow confidence interval. And in this case, we are much better off, of course, when we use these estimates. And we are much better off when we estimate the trend. This is the same as we did for the trend. Yeah. So this is what we get for the trend. The trend is, the estimate is 1 percentage point per year. The confidence interval is 0.4 up to 1.6, so much better. So this is actually what I touched upon a bit we have over very wide confidence intervals for the migrant workers because of the small sample size. The LFPR will have very wide confidence intervals. Some countries will not have carried out surveys, so they don't have any measure at all. So what can we do? What can be done instead of using very poor or non-existing estimates? Well, we can do imputation by using a model. And this is a model I discussed a few minutes ago. We can calculate the labor force participation rate for the population with a fairly narrow confidence interval because we have a large sample. And we find a constant value R based on data from a group of other countries. And we use this model to estimate the participation rates for migrants. Let's say the number of people 15 plus of age is 14.2 million in 2016. This is according to demographic projections that has been done based on the 2011 census. A labor force survey is done in 2016, and the number of people 15 plus of age is 12.9 million. So this is an estimate from a labor force survey, number of people 15 plus. So the question we can ask, which number should we use? Should we use the 14.2 million from a projection from 2011, or should we use the labor force survey results from 2016? Well, my answer would be we should use a projected number. Well, first of all, because the labor force estimate has a sampling error. This is not an exact number. It has a sampling error. Of course, the 14.2 also has an error because it is a projection. It can be a very good demographic projection, but still it is a projection, and there may be model errors in the projection. But still, I think we should use the projection. First of all, because we have sampling error. Second, the projection is some kind of official figure used in many different cases. And also, I have seen that when you estimate totals from sample surveys, some countries have used poor sampling weights when they blow up their data from sample level to population level. If your sampling weights are based on census data from 2011, they are in many cases a bit too low. When you add up the sampling weights, you get total, the sum of the sampling weights, the total, which is less than the projected numbers from the census. So there are a number of countries where I have seen that you have to do the sampling weights correct. You have to calibrate your sampling weights so they agree with the projected totals. Still another example. A country has conducted a census in 2001, and they have made projections up to 2030. In 2011, a new census is carried out, and it is found that the projection for 2011 from the census 2001 falls short of the 2011 census results. That means that the projection for 2020 also is below the true value. We want to present data for 2010 to 2019. What to do? Should we keep the inaccurate value, the projection for 2010, and use the census value for 2011 and new projections for 2012 to 2019? Or should we calculate a trend based on the census value 2001 and 2011 and impute the trend value for 2010? Yeah, so this is a situation. This is a census 2001. This is a projection. This is a projection value 2010. This is a census value 2011. This is a new projection up to 2019. If we do nothing, then we will use the projection here and the census value there and the projection there. That means that we get a growth rate of 3% per year. But that is a very high growth rate because we have based it on this low 2010 value. A better thing to do would be to use the projected trend and project backwards to 2010 and use this as our 2010 value. Then we get the projection growth rate 1.6 per year for the whole period from 2010 up to 2011. So, yeah, when we have looked at the data, we have a number of situations similar to this, where countries have provided census numbers for a new census, let's say 2014, but they are keeping old projected numbers for 2010 up to 2013, for example. And then we get these kinds of sudden jumps in the time series because one value is an old projection and the next value is a new, fresh census number. We need to adjust the old projections to get a reasonable time series. Okay, now a bit about the experiences from the third edition when we have been working with the data. Yeah, I quickly go through. The main purpose is to describe levels and trends in labor participation. It's more about describe levels and trends, not so much about analyzing details, what is happening in the countries. So that means that the readers of this report is mainly what I call describers, people who want to describe what is happening. And those people are in the governments, in the union, of course, in the regional, the RECs and international organizations. The things we get and present in the report, well, of course, they are a bit of an interest for what I call researchers and modelers, but generally speaking, the data we have or the results we have are a bit too crude and lack detail to be really useful for researchers and modelers. Yeah, we get data from different sources, census surveys, administrative data, we get data from UN, World Bank, ILO, and so on. The strategy is to get the data directly from the countries. The countries are the data owners. So the strategy is to get everything directly from countries. To do so, we have the questionnaire, International Labour Migration Questionnaire, ILMQ, that has been designed by the Joint Labour Migration Programme. 17 Excel tables, 47 countries responded. The estimation, this is what I have described now, a lot of different methods to fill in the missing data. So this is a model. This is LMSA. This is NSO, or any entity within the country that is responsible for responding to the questions in ILMQ. The NSO can get the data from their most recent census. They can get the data from the surveys. They can get the data from administrative data. They can also get their data from UN or ILO. They prepare the data for the questionnaire and send to us. I guess sometimes via the RECs to LMSA. An alternative way to do this would have been for LMSA to go directly to UN, ILO, World Bank to get the data from there, and if need be, to get supplementary data from the NSOs. This is not the model we have used. We have went directly to the countries, and there are of course good things and bad things by doing that, but that is what we have done. Yeah, this is a bit why we get differences. Well, we do different data modeling, projections, imputations, and of course, but we have also found cases where the NSO delivers data to us that differ from what has been delivered to, for example, ILO. So this is something we have learned for the next round, that there are different parts of the NSOs, and different parts of the NSOs may deliver different data to different places. So control of data, really important. And we learn as we walk, so to say, and there are more things to do there. This is a questionnaire just to indicate the holes we have in the data. You can see here we have data for 10 years for all the variables. But for example, total employed migrants, we have very few data points. So this is an illustration of the situation we have. Yeah, we have general empirical data, but we have a lot of model data, projections, extrapolations, pro rata calculations, and so on. And the data we have from the countries, they be genuine empirical data, like the results from census, but they may also be modeled data, like official demographic projections or simple, what I call simple ad hoc projections. So from what I call a typical country, we may have one census sometime from the period 28 to 2011, and then maybe 2 to 4 household surveys in the period 2010 to 2019. What I call a good country may have 2 censuses, one in 29 and one in 2019, and then annual labor force surveys, and maybe administrative data as well. So this is a very good country, because we have a census at the start 29 and at the end 2019. We will have a very good trend over our period, and because we have annual labor force survey, we will have very good results from that country. And lastly, a problematic country. We may have a census from 2001, and only one household survey sometimes in the period 2010 to 2019. As you can imagine, there is not very much you can do with such a country except making very poor imputations for more or less the whole period. Now I'm trying to calculate how old are the empirical, genuine data points in our data. Let's say we want to estimate something for the year 2018. And we assume that the estimate is entirely based on data from the most recent population census for each country. If we take the Central African Republic, the oldest census data is from 23. So the age of this genuine empirical data is 15 years in this case, when we want to estimate something for 2018. If a country has conducted a census 2014, the data age is 4 years. So I have calculated what is the average age of the empirical census data points for a 2018 estimate for Africa in our survey. And that age is 7.5 years. So if we put it in another way, we can say that the average length of the projections from the most recent census up to 2018 is 7.5 years. And that is a rather long projection. The uncertainty in that projection is for sure substantial. So the time series for the report are based to a large extent on projections, and this gives a rather rigid picture of the migration over time. We will not capture the year-to-year variation in the migrant stock. A substantial change in numbers from one year to another will not be reflected in the statistics. We need flow data for that. Yeah, I think I just skip. There are a number of ways to check the data. Data confrontation is of course important when we compare our results with the results of ILO and UN. Yeah, these are challenges. yeah, let's just look at the second point. Surveying migrants more difficult than surveying households and individuals in households. To get the proper sampling frame for migrants is much more difficult than people living in regular households. So that is a huge problem for the migrant surveys. Those are the sampling frame problems for the migrant surveys. Okay, very quickly, just about the future. For the next edition, the fourth edition, we have to improve a lot of things. And these are my ideas and opinions, not the opinions of any other. We need better editing. I think we can benefit a lot from closer cooperation with ILO especially, and maybe also with the UN. But from ILO we can use their models for doing some of their imputations. The R value, for example, we have already seen the R value in my slides here, where you set up a model for how the participation rates, labor force participation rates in migrants relate to the participation rates in the general population. So we can learn from that, and we can use these models for our data validation checks. I think we have to revise the ILMQ to have these 17 tables. The people in the NSO that are supposed to fill in these tables, they get exhausted just by looking at the Excel sheets with the 17 tables, and the data quality will suffer from that. We must make the ILMQ much shorter. Also, maybe we have to do very intense checking of data from the very big countries, because they have a big impact on the aggregates. A small error in a big country is much worse than a big error in a small country. Development work ongoing, standardized migrant surveys needed, use of administrative data needed. Final words. The LMSA is a work in progress. We are improving. We know there are a lot of things to work with in the next edition. We are learning, but it is also a learning process for the country of NSOs and Statafric. There are too many holes in the data sets. The story about missing data I have related here must come to a happy end. We must have much fewer holes in the data sets. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay. Thank you, Hans, so much. Thank you, Hans. Sorry. Participants, sorry about I have some echo, so I'm trying to resolve that. Okay. Thank you. I think now it's okay. Thank you, Hans, so much for the wonderful presentation that you've had and you've shared with us this afternoon. Indeed, it was really technical and detailed, providing an overview on the preparation of the surveys, giving us about the various estimations that were done in the labor, giving an example from the labor migration statistics report, and then also giving us insights about on estimations on and imputations on missing data, and also concluding your presentation by giving us an overview on how best we can improve the surveys so that we can have better results. Thank you so much for that. And now I just, and also one more thing I want to mention, thank you so much for keeping your time. So we have a few minutes so that you can respond to a few questions. I think we have a couple of questions that are directed to you. Maybe Kenza, assist me on this. We have, I think we have some questions on Q&A. Maybe you can get us.
Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you very much, Mr. Peterson. That was indeed an excellent presentation that I think all of us have benefited from. Very technical and very useful also in terms of statistical tools that could be used for estimating migration data. So without any further ado, as Brian mentioned, I will be reading the questions also to share with all the participants. So Mr. Peterson, I'm first going to read all the questions, and I also think that you have access to the Q&A bar, so that even if I go a bit fast while reading the questions, you still have access to each and every question. So far we have 4 questions. I'm first going to start with the Mr. Lotfi Harizi's question. In case of estimation of migrant numbers, can you please explain more about the confidence interval calculation and which method do you recommend for this calculation? So very important question, actually. The second question is from M. Komba. Can you please dwell a little on the advantages and disadvantages of borrowing from similar situations? What is your experience? And then another question from Mr. Lotfi Harizi. The demographic projection is based on hypothesis, and maybe the LF survey is more exact, especially in case of doing an updated listing in the EAAs. And then Mr. Mohammed H. Abdullahi, the design effect, is it fixed, and how could it be large or small? Is there a formula for calculating design effect? I think these are the 4 questions. The other one is a comment. So over to you, Mr. Peterson. Thank you.
Okay, start with the first one. In case of estimation of migrant numbers, can you please explain the confidence interval calculation? Well, when we present the migrant numbers, the total number of migrants or total number of migrants 15 plus, this is actually based on data from the countries. There may be data from their surveys, or maybe data from census, we don't know. In those cases, we have no way of calculating the confidence interval for these numbers. If the numbers are based on a census, then the confidence interval is 0, of course, because we have all the numbers within in the sample, so to say. But the confidence intervals I calculated in the presentation was mainly for the labor force participation rates, and those were based on a sample survey. And if you do a sample survey, labor force survey, you can calculate the rates like I did in my presentation. If you want to estimate the total number migrants from the survey, the confidence or the standard error calculation is a bit more complicated. So I think I have to refer you to textbooks how you do those kinds of confidence interval calculations. Yeah, so I don't recommend any calculation. Well, when you have a sample survey, then the textbooks will tell you how to calculate the confidence intervals. For the report, we have not calculated the confidence intervals because most of the data are based on census totals. So I go to the next question. Can you please dwell a little on the advantages and disadvantages of borrowing from similar situations? Well, to be honest, I have not worked very much with those situations. Well, the advantages is, of course, that if you really rely on your model and trust your model, this is an excellent way of getting fairly good estimates, although you don't have any data. The disadvantages is, of course, that if your model turns out to be poor, then you are probably in a worse situation than compared to if you have done nothing. But I know that the UN and the ILO and the World Bank, when they prepare their databases, they miss a lot of data like we do. Everyone is missing data. And to get the databases up and running, there is a need to impute for missing data. And in some cases, this has to be done by borrowing from other countries. I go to the third question. The demographic projection is based on hypothesis and may be the labor force survey is more exact, especially in case of doing an updated listing in the EAs. Yes, I would say that, well, first of all, demographic projections tend to be sort of the official truth in countries. Countries do demographic projections because they want to present the number of people and maybe also the number of migrants every year, and that is sort of an official figure. So if you do a labor force survey and you come up with a number that the total number of people or total number of people 15 plus, that is way above or way below the demographic projection, then I think that it takes a lot of bravery, so to say, to claim that what you get from the sample survey, the total number of migrants, for example, or total number of people 15 plus, that number is better than the projection. So in all the cases I have been working with, in household surveys, for example, I have assumed that the demographic projection is the true, sort of true value. And I always know that the estimate from the labor force survey is an estimate with a sampling error. So that means that I rely more on the demographic projection than the survey. And in fact, what I do is that I calibrate the sampling weights so that when I estimate the total number of people 15 plus from the labor force survey, I get exactly the number that we have in the projection. Of course, when you update the household listing in your EAs, you get a better number, a better estimate of the number of households in those EAs as compared to the census, and maybe also compared to the census projection. But still, you have to keep the sampling error in mind. So, yeah, if you're close to the demographic projection, you may rely on the labor force survey, but usually you calibrate your sampling weights to the demographic projections, if you have them. Next question. Design effect. Well, the design effect is different from variable to variable, different from survey to survey, from country to country. So, yeah, I could give a 2-hour lecture on design effects here, but that has to be sometime in the future, I think. The design effect I used, 1.2, is what you very often find in surveys where you survey individuals. If you survey households and you are estimating socioeconomic variables like household income in a household budget survey, then you will see that the design effect may be 3 or 4 in those cases. So, but in all the surveys you do, when you calculate the standard errors, you should use a software where you can get the design effects out of as output from the software. And nowadays you have in all the major packages, SPSS, Stata, and even in the R packages, you have procedures where you can get the design effects. So every time you do a sample survey, you should get your design effects because you will use them when you plan the sample size for the next round of your survey. Okay, I think that is what I can say. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans, for that response and providing your insights and feedback for our participants regarding the various questions that they have asked. But I would like to appreciate our participants and encourage you so much. If you have any questions, don't hesitate. Use the Q&A or share. Use our Q&A tab to share your questions, and we respond to them. So we are getting into the breakout session. So thank you, Hans, for that wonderful presentation. Much appreciated. Now, our next
Sorry,
session
Brian.
will be
Brian?
that is module 4 will be on Leave No Migrant Behind, looking at various data disaggregation and the sustainable development goals. So we have our presenters, Elisa and Nadia, who will be working on this. But before that, let's have a break of around 10, 12 minutes. So we resume our session immediately after 12 minutes. That is at 3:50 at this time. I think that is around 12:50 Tunis time. So let's have a break of 12 minutes. We'll be back in the next 12 minutes. Thank you. Colleagues, participants, welcome, and we have our presenters ready. Let me check with Nadia and Nadia and Elisa. Are you available? Elisa?
Yes.
Thank
hello.
you. Can see you. And Nadia?
Yes, Brian.
Okay. Thank you. I can see both. Welcome. Thank you. But before we proceed, I see Kenza, you have a hand. I don't know. Maybe is there something you want to raise, Kenza? Okay. Let me take it like maybe we'll check with Kenza whether there is anything that she wanted to raise because she has her hand up. Okay. Thank you. So we are now into the next module, that is module 4, where we are going to look at Leave No Migrant Behind in terms of data disaggregation and the Sustainable Development Goals. So I leave it up to you, Elisa and Nadia, for this session. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Brian, and thanks everyone for attending today. I'm excited to take part, and well done to everyone in the organizing team. I know that a lot of work went into this week, so I'm happy to be able to take part. I am just going to share my screen so that I can walk you through a PowerPoint. Excuse me just for 1 second.
Elisa, I could also share your presentation if you would like.
Actually, yeah, sorry, I don't want to take up people's time. That might be really good. If it's okay with you, Kenza?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I'm going to open it right now.
Okay.
Sure.
Brilliant. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Kenza. So,
Sure.
Sure. So sorry for the slightly slow start, everybody. My name is Elisa Mosler-Vidal, and I work at IOM's GymDAC with Kenza and other colleagues, focusing mainly on the Sustainable Development Goals and migration data, and focusing a little bit more on disaggregation of data, which is what we're here to speak about today. So I won't take up too much time because I think we're a little bit behind schedule and we want to leave enough time for discussion. But what I'll do today is quickly sort of introduce the topic and sort of get everyone up to speed on what migratory status disaggregation means in the context of development data, of SDG data, of other national data. And then I'll give a very short kind of introduction to what we know about migrants within the Sustainable Development Goals. So just to bring a little bit the topic to life before we get to the more practical part, I'll very quickly introduce you to some key statistics from some IOM and other research on what we know or don't know about migrants in the different goals. And then I'm going to walk you through a little bit more through some practical dimensions of disaggregation. So for example, what are key challenges and opportunities related to disaggregation with traditional data sources? What are some key definitions that are good to keep in mind? And this is also a part of the session where I would love to also hear from all of you present about disaggregation in your own contexts, in your own ministries and countries. So hopefully there's also some time for discussion on that. Next slide, please. Next slide. Great.
Sorry, Elisa, I'm just quickly, apologies about the technical issue. I'm just going to switch to the screen so that you can have a full image of it. Apologies about that.
No, thank you, Kenza. Okay, so just a quick recap on what we mean by the Sustainable Development Goals, where we're at today. So in 2015, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was adopted. And I won't go into too much detail about this big development framework, which is very much sort of based at the global level, but there are some key takeaways that relate to migration and to migration data. So the first is that really migration is mentioned in some of the Sustainable Development Goals explicitly. So there is one target that speaks about target 10.7 about safe, orderly and regular migration, about migration governance. And this is a kind of key opportunity to really include migration in a development framework for the first time. But when it comes to data and data disaggregation, there's really a few other really key entry points for us. And these are really linked to the motto of the whole agenda, which is to leave no one behind. As you've probably heard many, many times by now, we're all familiar with this slogan. In the actual document of the Sustainable Development Goals, different migrant subgroups are specifically named as, in some cases, vulnerable groups who should not be left behind. And so there's a real clear call for development to be inclusive and to really reach the furthest behind and to even identify those who may be being left behind. And one other sort of key entry point to the disaggregation agenda is that target 17.18 of the SDGs makes an explicit reference to disaggregating development data, so data related to health, education, other areas of development. It refers to disaggregating this indicator by a number of different dimensions, so income, gender, age, and a few others, but also migratory status. And this is kind of a key recognition at the global level that disaggregating data, so in other words, categorizing data by different population subgroups, in this case, whether someone is a migrant or not, it's a key recognition that doing so is sort of a key first step to making more evidence-based and inclusive policy when it comes to development. Next slide, please. So very briefly, I think mainly people on the call already know this, but at this point, we know that there are over 281 million migrants around the world. As I mentioned, these are recognized as a group who are sometimes, but not always, in a vulnerable situation in the context of the SDGs. This is part of the document. And we also know that migrants are in their everyday lives already key actors in sustainable development, meaning that they already contribute, whether it's through their labor activities or through their diaspora contributions or remittances, they are already in fact key agents who help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And so for this reason, it's really key to have data that's disaggregated or categorized by whether someone's a migrant or not only to see who may be being left behind, so to see which migrants may be being left behind in a particular area, perhaps early childhood education, perhaps in income, but it also would enable us to really see how migrants contribute to development themselves. And I'll get into a little bit more detail on this because this is a little bit abstract, I know. Next slide, and next slide, please. So even before that, however, the more practical aspect, I wanted to very quickly present some snapshots of information based on disaggregated data. I think when we speak about data disaggregation and the SDGs, these are very high-level concepts that can be very abstract, as I mentioned. And so for this reason, we put a little bit of research together in IOM GIMDAC as part of another project that I'll shortly mention that we just finished with the support of Statistics Sweden about capacity building on disaggregation. Next slide, please. So the first interesting thing that we found was that if you look at sort of the global SDG data, so at the indicators that countries produce all around the world on all 17 goals, officially, we really don't know much about where migrants are in those goals. We don't know if they are doing better off or worse off than the average person in any country when it comes to most of the goals. There's only one indicator out of over 230 in the SDGs that are disaggregated at the global level by migratory status. This is about occupational injuries for labor migrants. And so it's 881, as you can see on the screen. And this is just to give you a little bit of a flavor for how little we know about migrants in the SDGs. So when we speak about the SDGs being inclusive for migrant groups and calling for the first time for disaggregation, this is a great step forward to learn more about migrants and whether they're being left behind or not. But right now, the state of play has not changed so much since 2015. And we can see that out of many indicators that are reported every day about the SDGs, migrants are not really visible in this data. Next slide, please. However, we put together a little bit of existing evidence relating to different SDGs that do in fact disaggregate by migratory status. And I'm just going to present 2 or 3, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail today, but you're welcome to also look at this research yourself, and I'll share the relevant link at the end of the presentation. But we have here SDG 2, which is on hunger. And we know that while migrants often support positive nutritional outcomes, whether it's for themselves or for their families left behind, they themselves can be at higher risk of food insecurity in some contexts in relation to non-migrants. So perhaps the text is a little small for you, but I'll just quickly read out 2 of these sort of 4 examples that we have on the screen of different studies that were done around the world looking at this topic. And so in China, a study found that infants who had migrant parents, so parents who had migrated to work elsewhere, were less likely to be at risk of anemia than infants who had migrants who were at home. So this rate was 43 versus 66%. And then I mentioned also that migrants can also be more vulnerable to food insecurity. And we have one example from the US that uses disaggregated data looking at where children's mothers were born to look at this question. So the study found that 24% of US-born children with foreign-born mothers were, for fewer than 5 years, were food insecure, compared to just 10% of those with native mothers. And this is interesting because the study also disaggregated not only by where the mother was born, whether it was the US or not the US, but it also looked a little bit further, and it disaggregated by how long the mothers had lived in the US if they had not been born there. And so there's more details in the research that I'm happy to share after this session, but it's a sort of interesting example where we can see that, in fact, if we disaggregate by a person's parents' country of birth to see whether they're a first or second generation migrant, we get very interesting information, which is crucial for policymakers in order to create evidence-based policy in this case, for example, on nutrition. Next slide, please. So here we have one quick example about education. So goal 4 on education. Using disaggregated census microdata, I found that in over half of the world's top migrant receiving or hosting countries, foreign-born youth were more likely than native-born youth to be neither employed nor in education or training, which is also named NEET in practice. This data is based on the last census round, so now it's a little bit more outdated. Hopefully we can update this soon. And I won't go into detail on all the countries that you can see on the right-hand side, but this is also just to give you an idea of how data that was in fact already collected and that was in most cases nationally representative could be disaggregated by migratory status to show for young people the NEET rates. And so interestingly, as I mentioned, in most of the countries, migrants were more likely to be NEET. There were also some exceptions. So I think we have here Sudan and Armenia as 2. Next slide, please. So just a very final quick last example, looking at SDG 11 on cities, on urban planning. We have here some disaggregated data from the European Union. And so this looks at overcrowding rates in households. This data is from 2018, and it shows here 3 different rates of overcrowding since 2010 until 2018. And it shows what this is for citizens of that particular country, for non-EU migrants who are living in that country, and EU migrants who are living in that country. And we see that the rate here is very different. 30% of foreign citizens, so of migrants in European countries, were in overcrowded households, compared to just 18% of those who were from that country. And I think this is another interesting example, because this goes further than saying this is the rate for a migrant and a non-migrant, but it also shows what is the rate for migrants who are from the region and from outside the region. And we see that the rate is a little bit higher for overcrowding for those migrants who come from outside of the EU. Next slide, please. So I think perhaps this is best if you, the best way to do this is if you have any reactions, I forgot to mention at the beginning, or any comments, please put them in the chat, of course. And so I wanted to pause here very briefly also to ask you a few questions in terms of what statistics are disaggregated or not disaggregated in your country that are really important for migration policy in your context, what sectors tend to disaggregate data and not, and how are these data used for migration policy, or perhaps are they not used enough for policy? So these are sort of 3 large questions, I know, but I'll give you a few minutes just to, or for the rest of the presentation, feel free to put in reactions into the chat. I'm always interested to hear kind of in your own context and country, how often data is disaggregated or not, or whether you think this is something that should be focused on more or not. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to very briefly talk about more practical dimensions of this, and I'll be not too long-winded, so that also we have time to chat at the end. But I mentioned a few minutes ago that we recently published a guide on data disaggregation. This is a capacity building tool which you can download, and is also will be available in French later this month, and right now is also in English. And this really breaks down the concept of data disaggregation by migratory status, and it's intended to be a kind of user-centric, hopefully easy-to-use guide for anybody who works on SDG data, on migration data, or is just curious about how migrants can be more visible in any kind of data and how to include them. So I'm not going to speak about all of these topics, but just to give you a flavor for some of the content, we have some basics on definitions and common challenges, and then more in-depth sections on different SDGs. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go through all of these reasons why disaggregation can be important. I think we already mentioned a few indirectly when we went through the examples of the 3 SDGs. But just to recap, some key reasons to disaggregate include the fact that categorizing data by who's a migrant and who's not a migrant in different sectors can really be a key first step to understand characteristics of migrants in particular sectors, to then create more evidence-based and targeted policy that can reach them. Another sort of key reason is that this can also improve resource allocation and be sort of more effective in terms of aid money or money spent. So if we think about policy being more targeted, and for example, a nutrition campaign being able to more efficiently reach migrants who have poorer outcomes compared to natives for hunger, of course, the effectiveness of this program will increase if the targeting is effective. And just one quick other point to make here is that disaggregation by migratory status is not an end point. It should not be considered the only way that we can know whether migrants are being left behind or not. There are some limitations to this kind of information. For example, disaggregated data does not tell us why a situation is the way it is. So if we saw, for example, the EU overcrowding rates in houses, And this puts together data from different countries, obviously in the EU, and gives an aggregate picture. It should be noted that this kind of information is really key, in particular at the national level, to know what policies and programming may need to target migrants better. But it doesn't necessarily tell us why. It doesn't necessarily tell us why this may change over time. So one key point to make is that disaggregation is a sort of key first step to start to address the question whether migrants are being left behind, or whether perhaps they're also a key motor for development, and to let us know how they do that exactly. But it's kind of a key first step in order to know more and to conduct further research. Next slide, please. So then very briefly, concretely, what we mean by disaggregation, as you'll see in the next few slides, and also potentially if you look at the capacity building tool that I mentioned, a lot of different countries, even ministries within the same countries, use sometimes different definitions or different methods to disaggregate data. But sort of in practice, the most sort of standardized, accepted way to do this is to choose one of these two variables, the first being country of birth, and second being the country of citizenship. And so the first count kind of helps you distinguish between the foreign-born and native-born population, and the second can help us distinguish between foreigners and citizens. Next slide, please. And so a lot of countries or different government actors may choose to collect information on other additional variables, depending on the migration policy context, depending on if there's a specific subgroup that's more of interest than another one. It can be very simplistic to say country of birth or citizenship, here is migrant. Migrants are obviously not a homogeneous group. So for that reason, there's also plenty of other ways that if it's methodologically possible, countries may choose to also collect information on other variables to know more. I won't go through this whole list, but some key kind of also more accepted or common methods of disaggregation include period of arrival. So if, for example, a country is particularly interested in integration of its migrants, it may choose, if possible, to also disaggregate not only by one of the previous two variables, but also by when that individual arrived in that country, in order to then see over time, perhaps, whether outcomes in hunger, health, income, or labor market participation, whether that changes or not over time, or whether there are patterns between migrants who recently arrived or who arrived a long time ago. Another common variable is country of birth of parents. You already saw in the US example on nutrition how this can show us, for example, differences between different first and second generation migrant groups. A few other ones to highlight, maybe nationally defined variables. So I've spoken a little bit about some key variables that for example, the UN expert group on migration statistics recommends to use when disaggregating. In many cases, also countries may have their own variables that are not on this list that make a lot of sense at the national level to know a little bit more about. So an example of that could be a specific legal or visa category that one country uses. And in many cases, countries publish or disseminate sort of national statistics, not by country of birth or country of citizenship, but by a specific visa category that country uses. So that can be a way to get more sort of nationally relevant information. I should add that the one drawback for this is clearly that this information cannot be compared at the international level with data from other countries. Very briefly then, just finally, I mentioned that migrants are not a homogeneous group. This also means that wherever possible, additional disaggregation is also recommended by sex or gender, age, disability, status, and a few others, in order to sort of reveal any potential overlapping inequalities that may be affecting an individual. Next slide, please. So there are a few common challenges related to disaggregation, and I think just a few to highlight. One to highlight in particular is sample size. So when we look at using traditional data sources to disaggregate data, for example, household surveys, Often it's not possible to disaggregate that information by migratory status, even if the information is already collected. And this is because the sample size of the survey itself is not large enough to be representative for a migrant subgroup, because obviously migrant groups are smaller than the overall population. And so the methodology does not really allow for that data to be representative of all migrants in a country. I'm going to also go through some opportunities, not only challenges, but this is sort of a key one to keep in mind. And I'm sure that many of you in this session have already also experienced that. I'll just go through one more challenge, and this is one related to hard to reach populations. So I've discussed a little bit the sort of traditional data sources and key questions on country of birth or citizenship and how these can be included in a census or in a survey in order to get more information. However, when we speak about leaving no migrant behind, we're in some cases wanting to reach or wanting to at least know more about migrant subgroups who are not even included in traditional data collection at the national level. Populations such as irregular migrants or homeless migrants are not normally included in sample sizes in the first place. So there are also ways that exist to collect data or to complement official data with other information on such migrant subgroups, but this can also be a common challenge. Next slide, please. So there are also a few opportunities, not only challenges. The first is really that there's a lot more data that is in fact already disaggregated by migratory status at the national level than it often appears sort of at first glance. And one example of this is really administrative data. In many countries, administrative data systems that collect information for different administrative services within a country do collect information that's already fully compliant with the disaggregation definitions, or can often act as proxies for these. But often this information is, because it's purely used for administrative or service purposes, this isn't leveraged for statistics very often, but this also does mean that there's not necessarily a need to start from scratch every time. When people think of disaggregation, people often think of very expensive, huge surveys, and this doesn't need to be the case. So one sort of key opportunity is really to sort of do a data mapping, for example, at the country level, to see what is already collected that is disaggregated, and to see perhaps how to leverage this or integrate this with other data sources as well. Next slide, please. So again, we have a few questions here that it would be great to get some of your input on. Please have a look at these and feel free to type any reactions or comments in the chat. But we're always curious to hear about, in practice, how this sort of plays out in your countries. I've sort of walked you through a kind of generic introduction to the topic, but I'm sure that many of you already work in this or have more specific challenges that relate to these. And so I'm curious to hear about, for example, if you think about one migration policy topic in your country, could be anything: labor migration, unaccompanied migrant children, diaspora or remittances, anything. I'm curious to hear what disaggregated data would help you in this country understand this policy topic. What are data sources that you think are also relevant to this? And what are challenges or maybe potential solutions to use this kind of data and to disaggregate it to know more about that policy topic? I find that disaggregation is such a high-level topic that is obviously relevant to data all across sectors. We can talk about urban planning, we can talk about housing, roads, labor markets, and disaggregation is a very simple concept that can be applied to any of those. So I'm always interested to hear a little bit more about what could be sectors that you may focus on or want to focus on, and whether you think there's enough or not enough data that's disaggregated there. Next slide, please. So I'm just gonna, for the next few final minutes, walk you through a few more generic, even less technical steps about how to start a disaggregation exercise. Something that's key to keep in mind, that again, I'm sure many of you are aware of, is that disaggregation can often be sort of it can be an issue that's related to coordination or to political will. very often, as I mentioned, the data is already collected at the country level that's disaggregated, but there are other reasons why this data simply isn't being used. And so for that reason, at IOM, we put together a few more generic steps that can help a country, any ministry, any agency at any level kind of get started in thinking about if disaggregated data is needed, how to really find this in the sector that it's needed in. I won't go through all of these steps, but just to highlight one or two, awareness raising on this kind of topic can be really key. As you know, when we speak about disaggregated data, we often need to interact with those in ministries not involved normally in statistical data collection or outside of a national statistical office. There may be, for example, a need to engage local service delivery, local actors of municipal government, say, for example, related to migrant healthcare. And so for this reason, because disaggregation requires a lot of coordination, because it doesn't just, or usually doesn't just concern a population census or a household survey, some awareness raising is often needed to, with that ministry, really sort of introduce the topic and sort of, increase sort of a political will or buy-in around the topic. The second point that I'll highlight, I already mentioned, but I really want to just highlight its importance again, which is a data mapping. Again, this doesn't need to be a very expensive exercise. Disaggregation can be perfectly doable, and in a way it's already done in many countries at different levels. So for this reason, conducting a data mapping to understand a little bit more in different sectors what information is already there can be a key first step. Next slide, please. So the text here is very small, even for me. And so we're also, I think, running out of time a little bit. But I just wanted to highlight that we have, thank you, Kenza, don't worry. We have 9 goals that we can sort of focus on when it comes to providing more step-by-step guidance on disaggregation at IOM, and I'm happy to answer questions on or offline about this. But I just wanted to give you a snapshot of just one, which is on poverty, and to give you a little bit of a flavor of the guidance that we have available to download for you, because we really hope this can be helpful for you. And so what we've done is list the different indicators that relate to, for example, poverty, and looked at different data sources, different pitfalls, different common solutions as well, that other countries have also sort of found useful when disaggregating data in that sector. Next slide, please. Just to wrap up, I wanted to just quickly show a few examples of where, unrelated now to the Sustainable Development Goals, of a few examples of where different countries all around the world disaggregate national sort of key policy data by migratory status. And we have really varied topics from poverty, hunger, education, urban planning, labor, and health. And this is just to sort of really highlight that at the national level, even if it isn't framed in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals or a global framework, disaggregation is a concept that is already clearly used on a daily basis by NSOs around the world, as you know. And so when we speak about the topic in the context of the SDGs or in the context of expanding disaggregation, as I mentioned, this can seem a little bit daunting or expensive sometimes, but I just wanted to highlight that when it comes to also using nationally defined variables, this is a practice that's done all around the world and that can sometimes just require a little bit stronger and more effective coordination. Next slide, please. Next slide. So just very briefly to wrap up, just to highlight, we saw at the beginning how at the global level, the official data relating to the Sustainable Development Goals, this is not disaggregated by migratory status, meaning that we don't know whether migrants are being left behind, we don't know how far they are being left behind, or perhaps whether they're not being left behind at all. What we have are patches of evidence from mainly regions or for a few specific countries that we've put together to get a little bit more flavor around this. But the fact of the matter is that we still do not know enough about migrants in the context of development, so we don't really know how they're doing. And as we know, disaggregating data is a key first step to address that. So to leave no one behind, we really need better data. meaning really better disaggregated data as a first step. And I'll just wrap up by also saying that, as I mentioned, there are a lot of interesting, innovative examples of existing disaggregation at the national level. And so when it comes to sort of knowledge sharing and existing good practices that can be shared between countries, there's a lot more to be done. So I also hope that this kind of session or this kind of platform can be useful for those, even though we're online and not in person, to share a few experiences or to also share them with us, because we're always interested to hear. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Elisa. I don't know, we have Nadia.
Yes, Brian.
Okay, thank you, Nadia. I can see you. Okay, wow.
Sorry, Brian, perhaps we should just take a few questions before moving on with Nadia's presentation. Right, so Elisa, we have a few questions on the Q&A bar.
Great. Shall I read them out, or will you go through a few of them?
Sure. So you can go ahead. Please feel free to read them. Thanks, Elisa.
Thank you. Thank you for the comment from Sierra Leone about disaggregating data by national variables that that correspond to legal categories. This is a really good example. So just for others, we had a comment from Sierra Leone stating that the National Civil Registration Authority disaggregates data on foreigners and citizens and residents with labor permits or not. And so that's a good example of how a national category can then be the way that that disaggregation is done. But then I also see a comment from the same user that the NSO does not have. There's a challenge that many migrants are not captured in national planning, and I would assume that this is because that they're not included in national data collection in the first place. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, and I think it depends on what migrant subgroups you're talking about, but I would encourage you, and I'll put it also in the chat now, to have a look through the challenges section of the guide that I mentioned, because it does go through a few tips or a few other resources that can help undertake data collection on specific groups that really aren't included in, for example, censuses. So I hope that that might give you some practical signposting, but it's probably a little bit too detailed to go into here. There's another question on, are there countries in Africa where IOM and its partners have undertaken a mapping on migration data that is publicly available? I think Kenza may also have a bit of an answer on this, so I'll turn to her in a second if that's okay, or maybe she'll get back in touch with you on the chat. Sure. But I do know that at least on a project that I've been involved in the last few months, we have done a sort of more qualitative data mapping where we interviewed a number of NSO and other stakeholders who worked on migration data in different countries, and we'll be looking at synthesizing and publishing some results from that data mapping. And 2 countries there were in Africa, so Djibouti and Nigeria were included. This will not be published for, this will be published later in the summer likely, but it will be also shared with this group, and that should help you a little bit. Kenza, I don't know if you have anything to add on the data mapping, because I know that you also work on this.
Yes, thank you very much, Elisa. So when it comes to the data mapping in particular, IOM GIMDAG also in very close collaboration with IOM country missions in West Africa mostly, has developed some assessment reports to give you the exact countries actually. So we did an assessment report in Burkina Faso, in Niger, in Guinea, as well as in Côte d'Ivoire. And speaking of disaggregation also, we were able to send out questionnaires to different stakeholders working on migration data in each one of these countries. And part of that questionnaire was also on data disaggregation. So we were able to get as much information as possible regarding this particular aspect, and those assessments are actually being used by the governments of the four countries that I spoke about just now, in order to make sure that there is a continuation in what we have done, and also so that the governments will also be able to take into account the recommendations that we were able to highlight based on the consultations that we had with the government officials and stakeholders working on migration data. So that is when it comes to the assessment reports. And as Elisa said, she has been doing a great job also when it comes to assessment reports in other countries that I did not cite now. And allow me also just to jump in when it comes to Komba's question regarding whether IOM is partnering with governments on generating data on migrants, and the presentation will help this intervention greatly as we are at the initial stage. Okay, so when it comes to generating data, so at IOM we have different departments different departments who are working on migration data. I could think of one, for instance, DTM, which is the displacement tracking matrix. But what we have been doing also is we have another team at GEMDAC, but also with representatives throughout Africa working on missing migrants data. And other than collecting data, we also make sure to centralize the data and to disseminate it, and do the follow-up with the different governments. So I think that that's it from my side. I don't know if Elisa, you would like to add anything, but yeah, thank you very much for your very pertinent questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Kenza. I have nothing to add. Thanks very much for all the comments in the Q&A, and feel free to put some more in. We'll be online, obviously. So we'll receive them, but thanks very much, everyone, for attending.
Okay, thank you so much, Kenza and Lisa, for your response to our participants. So I'm afraid of time, but Nadia, please, you have the floor. Thank you.
Brian, can I share share my je peux partager l'écran, ça y est, l'écran est partagé. Brian.
Yes, you can see. Go ahead.
Okay. Je suis Nadia Touiri, chef de département des statistiques démographiques et sociales à l'Institut national de la statistique, chef du projet Migration internationale en Tunisie, Tunisia HIMSS. C'était un plaisir d'être avec vous aujourd'hui à l'occasion de l'école africaine sur les statistiques migratoires. Je remercie les présentateurs ce matin pour la qualité et les informations de leur présentation. Alors, pour cette présentation, je vais essayer d'évoquer les sources principales des différentes statistiques et données sur la migration internationale et les différentes désagrégations possibles, et ceci à travers le PowerPoint ne peut pas être... OK. Alors, Il y avait un problème technique, je ne sais pas pourquoi la présentation ne...
Madame Nadia, permettez-moi de vous interrompre. En fait, si vous voulez, dans ce cas, on va arrêter de partager l'écran et donc, dans ce cas, vous repartagez de votre côté, comme ça, vous pourrez suivre, si c'est
Oui,
OK
oui,
avec vous. D'accord.
j'aimerais bien partager mon écran.
D'accord. Merci, Nadia.
OK, merci. C'est bon?
Très bien.
OK, Salima. Alors, je vais essayer de présenter le contexte dont se trouve aujourd'hui la Tunisie, quelques des définitions clés et les deux sources essentielles aujourd'hui sur les données sur la migration internationale, notamment le recensement et l'enquête spécifique sur la migration internationale qui est en cours de traitement, c'est l'enquête tunisienne. Alors, le contexte dans la Tunisie aujourd'hui, on se trouve dans un contexte national et international très particulier pour la migration. Qu'est-ce qu'on a au niveau national? On a une transition démographique, une population en voie de vieillissement, dont les personnes âgées 60 et plus sont aux alentours, ils vont dépasser le 14%. Accès limité des jeunes au marché d'emploi, notamment les jeunes diplômés. Situation économique très difficile, instabilité politique, pandémie Covid-19 qui pour mettre cerise sur le gâteau. Au niveau international, on note également une dynamique et engagement sans précédent point de vue migration, pacte mondial pour les migrations sûres, ordonnées et régulières, déclaration de New York, ODD, forum, etc. Donc aujourd'hui, on se trouve dans un contexte sans précédent concernant vis-à-vis de la migration et concernant la migration internationale. D'où nous sommes amenés à faire une bonne gestion de la migration dans ce contexte. La collecte, tant au niveau national qu'international, la collecte et le partage des données sur la migration internationale sont recommandés en vue de contribuer à la bonne gouvernance de ce phénomène horizontal, tel que la migration. Et si peut-être la définition la plus importante ici, c'est la définition adoptée en Tunisie, c'est la résidence, notion de la résidence. Alors, en Tunisie, et pour des fins statistiques, c'est que la résidence, considérer résident sur le territoire tunisien, toute personne ayant passé 6 mois, au compte passé 6 mois sur le territoire tunisien. Alors, pour nous, un résident, il y a la notion de 6 mois, parce qu'au niveau international, il y a le 12 mois, il y a le 3 mois, mais pour la Tunisie, résidence en Tunisie est liée à une période de 6 mois. Alors, prenons comme première source le recensement. Alors, comme vous le saviez, le recensement est caractérisé par son exhaustivité, c'est-à-dire on couvre tout le territoire tunisien. La périodicité, malheureusement, 10 ans, et ça à cause de l'impact budgétaire et financier et même logistique qu'il faut assigner à cette opération. Pour mesurer la migration, parce que la migration est un phénomène rare, alors il faut prendre une période considérée, une période de référence. Alors en Tunisie, on le prend généralement, c'est 5 ans. Donc, le recensement comme source nous permet d'avoir des informations sur une période de 5 ans sur les catégories suivantes. Les immigrants de retour, les immigrants et les flux entrants et sortants. Et on va voir en détail comment on peut avoir ces différentes catégories de population. Alors, On commence par, dans le recensement, on a inséré 2 modules. L'insertion de ces modules, bon, le module immigration et le module émigration. Alors, pour le module immigration, c'est un module qui a été inséré dès 84, mais pour le module émigration a été inséré depuis le recensement 2004. Et à l'occasion de chaque recensement, on essaie d'améliorer les modules pour répondre aux besoins internes et internationaux dans la matière. Pour l'immigration, la question qui a été posée à l'occasion du recensement 2014, en avril 2009, c'est-à-dire 5 ans avant, nous habitons dans ce même logement ou pas? Donc, même logement ou bien autre logement. Si la réponse est autre logement, alors on va essayer d'avoir les données sur la résidence précédente, ou le pays, bien sûr, c'est à l'étranger. Milieu de résidence, le motif. En plus de ces 2 variables qui émanant du module immigration qui se trouve dans le questionnaire, on a 2 variables très essentielles qui se trouvent dans le module sociodémographique, c'est la nationalité et le lieu de résidence des parents au moment de la naissance de la personne interviewée. Alors, ce package de variables, qu'est-ce qui nous permettra d'avoir? Alors, on peut, j'ai essayé de simplifier ou de schématiser comment on peut avoir les différentes catégories de population à travers ces variables-là. Alors, si la réponse autre logement, si la résidence antérieure, c'est en Tunisie, donc on parle d'une migration interne, si la résidence antérieure était à l'étranger, alors si on aura soit des personnes de nationalité tunisienne, soit des personnes de nationalité, autre nationalité, c'est-à-dire nationalité non tunisienne. Pour ceux ayant la nationalité tunisienne, en fin du compte, ce sont des migrants de retour, ce qu'on appelle migrants de retour. Ces migrants de retour, on peut distinguer 2 catégories, soit des personnes nées en Tunisie, ayant passé une période de résidence à l'étranger, puis retour en Tunisie, soit ce sont des personnes nées à l'étranger et ils sont résidents en Tunisie au moment du passage le 28 avril 2014. Pour ceux de nationalité, autre nationalité, alors ce sont en fin du compte ce sont des immigrés. C'est par là qu'on mesure le flux des immigrants. On peut avoir soit ceux de nationalité nés en Tunisie ou bien nés à l'étranger. Pour ceux qui sont nés en Tunisie, alors ici, c'est vraiment le tricky. Ils sont comptés dans le stock des étrangers qui se trouvent sur le pays, mais ils ne peuvent pas figurer dans le flux. Donc, il faut faire attention ici pour cette matching entre les 2 catégories. Alors, si on utilise autre schéma qui peut se présenter ici, la population résidente en Tunisie en avril 2014, selon la nationalité, on a ceux de nationalité tunisienne et les autres de nationalité non tunisienne. Pour ceux de nationalité non tunisienne, en fin du compte, c'est le stock des immigrés, c'est les étrangers qui résident en Tunisie. Il y a ceux qui sont nés en Tunisie et les autres sont nés à l'étranger. Donc, en fin du compte, c'est les 2 schémas à travers lesquels on peut capter soit les stocks, soit les flux entrants pour une période bien déterminée. Ça, ce que j'ai exprimé, c'est à travers le module immigration qui a été inclus dans le questionnaire. Bon, si on récapitule, à travers ce module, on peut capter la population étrangère résidente en Tunisie, la population résidente tunisienne née à l'étranger, les Tunisiens migrants de retour et les flux entrants. Quelles sont les désagrégations possibles? Alors là, l'immigration, ce module, malgré les quelques insuffisances, mais s'avère une source vraiment incontournable, en absence des sources administratives, bien sûr, représente une opportunité pour faire des agrégations. Ample batterie d'indicateurs permettront wide disaggregation. En effet, pour chaque catégorie de personnes, de population citée auparavant, les informations thématiques sont disponibles. C'est-à-dire, si on prend par exemple l'étranger qui réside sur le territoire tunisien, on peut déterminer les caractéristiques démographiques, sexe, âge, état matrimonial, nationalité, distribution territoriale au niveau de la Tunisie, la fécondité, les caractéristiques éducationnelles, analphabétisme, niveau d'instruction, scolarisation, diplôme, et surtout le croisement avec les caractéristiques économiques qui permettra notamment d'identifier les travailleurs migrants ou la migration de travail. Taux de chômage, taux d'activité, taux d'occupation, secteur d'activité, profession, statut dans la profession, période de recherche d'emploi, tout. Et bien sûr, même des autres informations telles que handicapés, couverture sociale et sanitaire, logement et conditions de vie de ménage, accès à l'eau potable, accès au logement, type d'habitat, etc. Donc, et bien sûr, septième point, c'est les caractéristiques socio-démographiques et conditions de vie des travailleurs migrants sur le territoire tunisien. Alors, on passe maintenant au module émigration, c'est-à-dire les personnes, les sortants, les personnes qui quittent la Tunisie pour aller ailleurs. La question est la suivante. Y a-t-il un parent qui réside actuellement à l'étranger et il a résidé avec le ménage en avril 2009? C'est-à-dire, ici, l'approche, c'est comment rapprocher les émigrés à travers leur ménage d'attache. Ça, d'une. D'autre part, même les ménages qui partent en totalité, on a essayé de minimiser leur nombre en essayant d'avoir des informations des neighborhoods, au moins 3 voisins, pour avoir au moins une idée sur la composition du ménage, ainsi que leur sexe. Donc, la question qui se pose ici, si le ménage ont une personne, un individu qui a quitté le ménage pendant les 5 dernières années, alors on collecte les informations suivantes. Quelles sont ces informations-là? Nom et prénom pour des fins de contrôle, lien avec le chef de ménage, année de naissance pour capter l'âge, sexe, niveau d'éducation au moment de départ, pays d'accueil, résidence actuelle, c'est-à-dire si la personne a quitté la Tunisie, première entrée, c'est l'Italie, et au moment de passage, elle réside en France, donc c'est la France comme pays de résidence actuelle qui sera déclaré au moment du RGPH. Et bien sûr, les motifs de l'immigration ou bien le motif de départ. Et dernier point, la demande pour capter les migrants travailleurs comme proposition, c'est d'inclure une variable sur la situation économique au moment de départ. Pourquoi pas actuelle? C'est une proposition pour le RGPH 2024. Alors, à travers ce module, on peut mesurer le flux sortant ou encore le stock des émigrés tunisiens à l'étranger durant une période bien déterminée. La période, c'est 5 ans, c'est une période jugée nécessaire pour capter un phénomène aussi rare tel que l'émigration. Caractéristiques des sortants, on peut avoir une distribution par sexe, distribution par âge, distribution par région de départ, distribution par niveau d'instruction, par motif d'émigration, par pays de résidence actuelle et les conditions de vie de ménage d'attache et non pas de l'émigré. Bon. Alors, ces modules-là, on a vraiment pleinement exploité ces 2 modules. Ici, à gauche, c'est une publication qui se trouve sur le site sur les caractéristiques migratoires. On trouve une tabulation très détaillée sur les différentes catégories que j'ai citées au début de ma présentation. Et pour simplifier la tâche pour les décideurs et les decision makers, on a produit une flash 4 pages pour faire vendre ou bien pour mieux expliquer, simplifier les notions et faire passer le message concernant la migration interne et internationale. Ça a été le flash pour la migration interne et internationale, mais on a zoomé sur la migration internationale. On a essayé de simplifier les choses dans ce flash pour faire une dissémination auprès des différentes catégories de population. Et peut-être il y a une publication que je n'ai pas mis ici, c'est une publication par gouvernorat et où on a mis les flux entrants-sortants par même délégation. La délégation, c'est une subdivision administrative le plus fin en Tunisie. Et ces indicateurs-là ont été utilisés, largement utilisés par les autorités locales pour faire leurs plans stratégiques et leurs estimations, etc. C'est vrai qu'on a pleinement profité de ces 2 modules, mais ça ne nie pas que l'insertion, surtout de le module et migration dans le recensement, présente certaines limites. Primo, le choix de la période de référence. De préférence, la période sera liée à un événement très particulier par exemple, la pandémie, c'est une très belle référence. Le départ de ménage en sa totalité, on a essayé, comme j'avais dit, on a tenté à estimer à travers les voisins d'avoir des informations sur les ménages qui partent en totalité, mais ça n'empêche qu'il y a des ménages qui échappent à notre couverture. La situation socio-économique, elle est inconnue dans les pays d'accueil, surtout pour les migrants travailleurs, leurs droits, leur accès, différents services, aides, etc. L'insertion des immigrants, les droits des immigrants. Pour les immigrés, les limites qui se trouvent, c'est l'histoire de la migration est inconnue, surtout aujourd'hui en Tunisie, les migrants subsahariens, leur trajectoire migratoire pour accéder en Tunisie, accéder à la Tunisie, l'intégration en Tunisie, l'accès aux services de base, surtout dans cet contexte de pandémie, et les problèmes rencontrés en Tunisie des immigrants, notamment les immigrants subsahariens en Tunisie. Donc, on passe maintenant à notre deuxième source, c'est l'enquête spécifique, enquête nationale sur la migration nationale en Tunisie. C'est une abréviation en Tunisia HIMS qui a été implémentée malgré le contexte sanitaire dans le pays entre 2020 et 2021. Alors, Tunisia HIMS, c'est un projet d'enquête conçu dans le cadre du projet Medin's Household International Migration Survey in the Mediterranean Countries. C'est un projet financé par l'Union européenne et ceci dans le but de surmonter l'insuffisance d'informations statistiques sur la migration internationale en Tunisie à travers la collecte de données fiables et représentatives des dynamiques migratoires et leurs déterminants. L'Institut national de la statistique s'est chargé de l'implémentation de projets. L'implémentation est faite en étroite collaboration avec les différentes structures nationales qui s'approprient ce projet, notamment l'Observatoire national de la migration. Quels sont les objectifs de cette enquête? Primo, c'est d'étudier les causes, déterminants, dynamiques et conséquences récentes des migrations internationales, ainsi que les liens entre la migration et le développement local. collecter, traiter et analyser des données fiables détaillées servant à étudier les tendances récentes des migrations internationales. Utiliser les méthodologies, bien sûr, des questionnaires à ceux des pays participants au projet MEDINS pour faciliter les comparaisons internationales. Et explorer des scénarios, bien sûr, comme résultat, en se basant sur ces données, on va essayer d'explorer plus précisément nos partenaires nationaux vont explorer des scénarios de coopération plus étroits dans le domaine de la migration et du développement entre les pays d'origine et les pays d'accueil. La méthodologie. Donc, la méthodologie qui a été utilisée, on a notre base de sondage, c'était la base d'RGPH 2014. Le RGPH 2014 est la source la plus récente et la plus exhaustive qui existe. Le RGPH 2014 a permis de cibler les zones selon la prévalence de chaque catégorie de migrants. Il a permis également d'avoir une distribution territoriale des catégories de migrants suivants. Les migrants de retour, les immigrants sur une période de 5 ans, et si les immigrants, prenons comme hypothèse que les régions ou bien les subdivisions administratives qui de forte immigration, ils gardent cette spécificité d'être des régions Sanda region, des régions qui de forte concentration des migrants. Les immigrés, on a aussi les ménages avec ou sans migrants. Donc, à travers, en fin du compte, c'est grâce au module qu'on a inséré à l'occasion du recensement RGPH 2014 qu'on a pu exploiter la base de sondage du recensement RGPH 2014 pour faire un plan de sondage stratifié pour accéder à cette catégorie de population. Sachant que nous avons planifié de faire l'enquête juste après le recensement pour profiter d'une base de sondage fraîche, mais malheureusement, vu l'implémentation nécessite des engagements financiers très importants, nous étions à la recherche des fonds et ce n'était pas possible juste après le recensement. Donc, le champ de l'enquête, la couverture était totale. L'exécution de l'enquête a été sur 2 phases. La première phase était une phase de ratissage. Au cours de cette phase, qu'est-ce qu'on a? 2 objectifs essentiels qui ont été assignés à cette phase. Premièrement, c'est de mettre à jour, update les enumeration area, les unités primaires. Vu que le recensement, on est à 6 ans du recensement, donc on a mis à jour ces enumeration area. Secondo, c'est de faire le ratissage des différentes catégories de migrants qui se trouvent dans chaque ménage. L'output de cette phase nous a permis de tirer un échantillon avec la population cible. Et la collecte était sur la période octobre et avril 2021. La taille de l'échantillon de ratissage, pendant la première phase, on a ratissé aux alentours de 120 000 ménages et la collecte a été auprès de 34 000 individus, toutes catégories de migrants confondus. La taille de l'échantillon est jugée suffisante pour produire au niveau national et même régional pour chaque type de migrant des estimations acceptables. Alors, notre population cible, c'est, ici j'ai mis les questionnaires que nous avons ainsi que l'éligibilité. Pour les ménages, on a tous les ménages enquêtés. Le questionnaire ménage va être rempli, tous les ménages enquêtés, pour voir en fin du compte ce module, ce questionnaire permettra de 2 choses. Une, d'identifier les différentes catégories de migrants qui existent dans le ménage Secondo, il nous permet de déterminer les caractéristiques et les conditions de vie des ménages pour voir l'impact de la migration sur les ménages, sur les familles left behind ou bien les ménages d'attache. Le migrant actuel, c'est qui le migrant actuel à travers cette enquête? Il résidait habituellement dans le ménage, un ménage d'attache au moment de la migration et actuellement, il est à l'étranger. Ou encore ici, c'est le ménage qui part en totalité, mais qui, on a essayé de l'approcher à travers les voisins. Le migrant de retour, c'est le migrant qui résidait en Tunisie et a émigré vers l'étranger et a retourné en Tunisie, période de résidence à l'étranger 3 mois et plus. Donc ici, on était obligé de fixer le timing, c'est que pour nous, à l'occasion de l'enquête, c'est que un Tunisien qui part de la Tunisie et réside à l'étranger une période de plus que 3 mois, c'est un migrant de retour. Le non-migrant, on a essayé de voir le migrant potentiel en remplissant un questionnaire pour les non-migrants, c'est-à-dire les personnes qui n'ont jamais émigré, qui n'ont jamais quitté la Tunisie pour résider ailleurs 3 mois et plus. Les immigrés ou les immigrants, nationalité non tunisienne et réside en Tunisie. Et on a fait une exception ici parce que pour les Tunisiens, les Tunisiens de double nationalité qui sont nés à l'étranger mais résident en Tunisie, on a rempli pour eux des questionnaires des immigrants parce qu'on a trouvé que le migrant de retour, les questions que se trouvent dans le migrant de retour ne reflètent pas vraiment leur parcours migratoire. Donc, on a fait une exception, on a rempli pour eux le questionnaire des immigrants au lieu de remplir les questionnaires de migrants de retour. Les migrants forcés, pour cette catégorie, on n'a pas vraiment un échantillon spécifique, mais on a essayé de les capter à travers les échantillons des autres catégories qui existent et on a eu un échantillon représentatif qui nous permettra de déterminer les caractéristiques des migrants forcés. Et bien sûr, on a le dernier questionnaire, c'est le questionnaire sur les conditions de vie et les transferts. Tous les ménages enquêtés sont concernés par ce questionnaire. Alors, en tout, on a 5 questionnaires et 5 enquêtes. Chaque questionnaire assigné pour chaque catégorie est composé aux alentours de 8 sections, mais les questions se diffèrent d'une catégorie à l'autre, mais les sections sont presque les mêmes. D'abord, on capte l'histoire migratoire, le processus migratoire pour être en Tunisie ou pour être ailleurs, le processus éducationnel, quelle est l'éducation avant le départ, après le départ, est-ce qu'il a terminé ses études, est-ce que son niveau est le même niveau de départ, l'analphabétisme, IT illiteracy. La troisième section, c'est l'état matrimonial, la fécondité, les nombres d'enfants, est-ce que les enfants sont retournés, est-ce qu'ils restent là-bas, la relation avec la société de départ et la société d'arrivée. Section 4, c'est essentiellement sur la situation de pré-immigration et motivation pour immigrer. 5e section, c'est sur les réseaux de migration et d'assistance au cours de la migration. Section 6, c'est sur l'historique et les mobilités professionnelles. Section 6A, c'est une section qu'on a ajoutée parce que on a démarré en plein Covid, donc c'était essentiel de capter l'impact du Covid-19 sur la situation économique du migrant, notamment le travailleur migrant. La 7e section, c'est l'intention de migrer et perception des expériences migratoires. Et si le migrant s'exprime sur la discrimination, sur le racisme, sur l'intégration, en fin du compte, c'est une section qui peut renseigner sur l'intégration du migrant dans la société d'accueil, que ce soit pays d'arrivée ou pays de destination. Et la dernière section, on a essayé de capter les transferts du migrant, que ce soit en nature ou financière, c'est-à-dire... Donc ici, quelles sont les désagrégations possibles pour les différentes catégories de migrants? Pour chaque catégorie de migrants, les désagrégations de base suivantes sont disponibles. Par sexe, par groupe d'âge, par niveau d'instruction. On peut largement capter la migration de travail, profession, secteur d'activité, situation dans la profession avant et après la migration, l'impact Covid, par statut migratoire, par année de départ, d'arrivée, par motif de départ, d'arrivée, par pays de destination, de départ, par région d'arrivée, de départ en Tunisie, par nationalité. Même ici, on peut plus ou moins capter la migration clandestine, que ce soit ici ou ailleurs. On a également des désagrégations spécifiques à chaque catégorie qui seront également détectées et disséminées. Le parcours migratoire, les réseaux de migration possibles, le coût de migration, les transferts, la discrimination et insertion sociale, l'aide et assistance dans le pays d'accueil, relations avec les pays d'origine. Donc, j'aimerais bien partager avec vous l'état d'avancement. Nous sommes en cours de traitement et exploitation des données. Septembre 2021, on aura la dissémination des premiers résultats. 4e trimestre de 2021, c'est la dissémination du rapport descriptif. Et encore, en outre, 4e trimestre 2021, c'est le démarrage des analyses approfondies identifiées par les différents partenaires nationaux. Peut-être la seule chose que je peux ajouter ici, que la première phase qu'on a entamée nous a permis d'estimer non pas les distributions, mais aussi en termes d'effectifs les différentes catégories de migrants qu'on a rencontrées. Donc, merci. C'est le logo de l'enquête. Brian, je vous passe la parole.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nadia, for your wonderful presentation, giving us an example of Tunisia on how disaggregation of migrant data is done, and also giving us a more specific example from the survey that you are conducting migrant workers. Thank you so much. I was almost cutting you short, but given the rich knowledge that we have and the example that we have from Tunisia, and we want to elaborate that or expand that to other participants to learn on this, on how they can apply similar methodology or borrow some ideas. So I think it was nice to have you complete the presentation. But perhaps maybe we can take one question because we are over our planned time by more than 1 hour. Maybe you can take 1 or 2 questions for Nadia, and then we can end the session today. Kenza, I don't know whether we have any
sure.
question
yes,
on
yes,
that
Brian.
note for Nadia.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I'm going to read out a couple of questions. I think there was one main question and the other ones were comments. You are getting lots of congratulations, Nadia, about this fantastic presentation that you just made. So I'm going to switch to French as I will read the next question. Dans le module émigration, est-il important de considérer la désagrégation par rapport aux conditions de vie du ménage d'attache? car il se pourrait que ces conditions aient été changées entre le départ et le moment du recensement. Et donc, si elles étaient mauvaises au moment du départ, elles pourraient être considérées comme le motif de départ du migrant. Voilà.
Je réponds, OK. La question, vraiment, c'est une question très importante parce que si la migration est très... la période qu'on a, c'est 5 ans. C'est-à-dire, sur 5 ans, si la situation de ménage va changer grâce à cette émigration, c'est-à-dire les migrants, il va faire des transferts, etc. Alors, je crois que la période est assez short period, assez courte pour avoir un changement radical, point de vue, conditions de vie de ménage. Je crois que moi, c'est ce que avoir les conditions de ménage d'attache, c'est très important pour étudier, pour faire une étude plus approfondie sur les raisons derrière le départ d'une telle personne. Ça enrichit la recherche, ça enrichit l'analyse. Donc, c'est ça. Kenza?
Oui, merci beaucoup, Nadia. Thank you very much for all your questions. I would just like to perhaps justify the fact, explain the fact that we'll carry on following up with your questions. Please don't hesitate to ask more questions as we go also. There is one question that keeps on coming up actually on the chat and on the question bar, which is whether the presentations will be shared or not. So every single presentation will actually be shared at the end of the online school. And I shared with you a webpage where you will be able to have access to each presentation. We just don't want to share them now just yet because the online school is ongoing, but we will make sure to upload every single one of the presentations that you are following into the webpage that I will share once again on the chat bar. Thank you very much. Over to you, Brian.
Okay, thank you, Kenza. Thank you, Nadia, for your wonderful presentation. And also, I want to appreciate our presenters today. That is Hans, Elisa, and Nadia for the wonderful presentation that they have shared with us, and more information that is very rich on estimation methods, and also migration data disaggregation, looking at the example of on the global perspective and also at country level with the example from Tunisia. Thank you so much for that. And quick reminder to our participants, this is not the end of the Q&A. If you have any questions, you can write directly to our technical team, or you can also share your Q&A to our organizers so that we can keep them on record and respond to you. So that brings us to the end of today's session. So tomorrow we'll have 2 sessions, that is session 4 and session 5. Specifically, the 2 sessions will be dealing with migration data with a special focus on labor migration and a focus on children and gender. So we welcome you all for tomorrow's session, and we are happy that you are keeping us on this platform very active until this time, even if you are taking more time. I think it's because of the rich knowledge that we have on the presentations. And thank you for bearing in mind with us and staying with us on all this time. So we welcome you again tomorrow for tomorrow's presentation, and we are happy to see you tomorrow. Thank you so much. Have a good evening, good afternoon, or a good morning. I don't know from where you are. Thank you.